My sister Emmeline, Emmy, to the family. Miss Price to the county, had a gift I have spent 30 years attempting to describe accurately, and have not yet managed. It was not beauty, though she was pleasant-looking. It was not wit, though she had more of it than anyone I have ever met before or since. It was something simpler and considerably rarer. She was entirely, unself-consciously herself in every room she entered, and the rooms could make of that what they liked. Most rooms, in my experience, made nothing useful of it. The rooms of Haverton Close, our father's rectory, the assembly rooms above the market square, the lending library at the cathedral gate, the bishop's dining room where the county gathered on its good behavior, were rooms that rewarded performance. You performed your rank, your eligibility, your amiability, your prospects. You performed the correct degree of interest in other people's opinions of you. Emmy did not perform. She arrived, she was herself, she said what she meant, she listened with the real attention of someone who actually cared what you were saying, and she left when it was time to leave. The rooms found this puzzling. They did not, generally, know what to do with her. I am Tobias Price. I am Emmy's older brother by 3 years, a schoolmaster at the Haverton Grammar School, a bachelor by disposition rather than design, and the person who was present for all of what I am about to tell you. I set it down now because Emmy asked me to once, not in those exact words, but in the way she asked for things she actually wanted, which was obliquely and only once, on the understanding that you would either hear it or you wouldn't, and either way she would manage. I heard it. I am a schoolmaster. I pay attention to what is said once and not repeated. This is the account of the autumn and winter of the year. The Duke of Streving came to Haverton, said the most careless thing I have ever heard a man of consequence say about a woman of worth, and spent the following 3 months learning what it cost him. He did not, in the end, lose what he might have lost, but it was a very close thing. And the reason it was a very close thing was entirely his own doing, and I say this as a man who liked him, eventually, and found him considerably improved by the experience. Begin then at the assembly. The Haverton Autumn Assembly was held every year in the first week of October, in the rooms above the market square that the county considered its premier social venue, and that I considered a pleasant enough place to observe human nature in concentrated form. The rooms held perhaps 80 people at capacity. They smelled, as assembly rooms always smell, of beeswax and powder, and the particular mingled warmth of many people who have made an effort with their appearance. The musicians at the far end were reliable if not inspired. The punch was acceptable. Emmy came with my mother and our younger sisters, in the way she always came to these things, without expectation and without dread, which in my experience is the rarest possible combination. She wore a gown that was sensible and neat and not fashionable, because our father was a clergyman of modest living and fashionable gowns were not among his provisions. She had done her hair herself, because the girls were too young to help, and our mother's hands were not what they had been. She looked exactly as she was, a young woman of 27, intelligent and self-possessed, and entirely without the careful performance of eligibility that the assembly rooms demanded of women in their situation. The Duke of Streving arrived at 8:30 with his party of 4, 2 gentlemen of the county whose names I knew, a woman I took to be his sister by the resemblance, and the ease of manner that money and consequence had been producing in men of his kind for several hundred years. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular confidence of a man who has been the most significant person in every room he has entered since the age of 18. He was not unkind in his manner. He was simply, entirely unconscious of the weight of the space he took up, in the way that people who have always taken up a great deal of space become unconscious of it. I noticed him because the room noticed him. That is the nature of these things. Rank arrives and the room recalibrates subtly, like a scale adjusting its balance. Emmy did not recalibrate. She was talking to Mrs. Alderton about the new botanical volume in the lending library, and she continued talking about it, which was characteristic. The first collision happened during the dancing. There was a set forming that required more partners than were available, and Mrs. Alderton, who organized these things with the firm pleasantness of a woman who had been organizing Haverton social occasions for 20 years, approached the Duke's party and asked whether the gentlemen might be willing to fill the set. The gentlemen were willing. The pairings were arranged. Emmy, who had been standing without a partner because there were more women than men, found herself in the set opposite the Duke of Streving. They danced. I watched from the side as I generally watched, because my dancing was acceptable and my watching was better. What I saw was, the Duke performed the steps with the competent ease of a man who had danced all his life and found it neither difficult nor interesting. Emmy danced the way she did everything, attentively, with the precise economy of a woman who had learned to make the most of what was available to her. When the figure of the dance brought them opposite each other, she looked at him with the clear, direct attention she gave to everyone and said something. I could not hear it over the music. He looked faintly surprised, not displeased, but caught off guard, which was, I suspected, an unusual experience for him. After the set, they were returned to their respective positions. Emmy came back to Mrs. Alderton and me. I asked what she had said to him. I asked whether he had read the new botanical volume, she said. And he had not, she said. He seemed uncertain whether he was expected to have done. I told him it was entirely optional and he looked relieved. I smiled. You disarmed him. I merely spoke to him, she said, with the mild surprise of someone to whom this distinction was obvious. It is not my fault if people expect something other than speech from a conversation. I looked at the Duke of Streving across the room. He was saying something to one of his companions with the restored ease of a man back in familiar territory. He had not looked toward Emmy since the set ended. I thought nothing of this. It was an assembly. People danced and talked and moved on. It was the nature of things. I was wrong to think nothing of it, but I did not know that yet. The thing happened an hour later. I had stepped out to the corridor. The rooms were warm and I wanted air, and I was standing near the door when I heard two men approaching from the far end of the passage. I knew the voice of one of them, Carrington, a local landowner of moderate consequence who had been at school with me and had spent the years since then becoming more pompous in inverse proportion to the increase in his estates. The other voice was the Duke's. Pleasant enough rooms, the Duke was saying, in the manner of a man making a polite observation about something that interested him very little. The county does its best, Carrington said, with the local man's mixture of pride and apology. The Price girl was making eyes at you, I noticed. I went very still. The schoolmaster's sister, the Duke said. Was she? I didn't notice. She's considered rather clever, Carrington said, in the tone that people use when they mean, which is considered to be her chief misfortune. Clever, the Duke repeated. A brief pause in which I had the impression of a man glancing back at a room in his mind and dismissing what he found there. She is nobody, Carrington. A clergyman's daughter with no portion and no connection. Quite pleasant-looking, I grant you, but nobody. They passed on. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I went back inside. Emmy was where I had left her, talking to the curate's wife about something to do with the lending library's new cataloging system. Her face was composed. It was more composed than usual, which in a less attentive brother might have passed for entirely normal. She had heard. I knew it the way you know things about people you have grown up beside, not from evidence, but from the particular quality of the stillness she was holding. Emmy was not a woman who held herself still. She was a woman who moved and talked and engaged, with the natural ease of a person who expected the world to be interesting. This stillness was the stillness of someone who has received a blow and decided, in the moment of receiving it, that they will not let it show. I went to her side. I did not say anything. She continued her conversation for another 5 minutes, said her goodbyes with the warmth that was genuinely hers, found our mother, collected our sisters, and took her leave of the assembly with the composure of a woman who had decided when she came in that it was pleasant enough and who was now deciding that it was time to go. She gave no indication to anyone watching that anything had changed. In the carriage home, she looked out the window at the dark Haverton streets and did not speak until we were nearly at the rectory. Then she said, "Tobias." "Yes," I said. "I think I shall ask Mrs. Alderton tomorrow about the position at the cathedral school, the one for a reading tutor." "I thought you were considering the Hartley children's governess position." "I have changed my mind about that," she said, without elaboration. "The cathedral school seems more interesting." "It is," I said. She nodded. She looked out the window again. I said nothing more. It was not mine to say. But I understood. She was deciding, quietly and without drama, that the world which contained men who looked at her and saw nobody was a world she would arrange herself to need as little as possible. Not in bitterness, not in retreat, but with the practical intelligence of a woman who understood that you cannot spend your life waiting to be correctly perceived by people with no incentive to perceive you correctly. She was the most sensible person I have ever known. She was also wrong this once, but I am getting ahead of myself. October at Haverton was the month that Emmy became, entirely without meaning to, the most talked about woman in the close. This is perhaps a strong claim for a cathedral city of moderate size and considerable self-importance. I moderate it only slightly. She became the most talked about woman among the people who were paying attention to things that mattered, which was a smaller group than the assembly rooms suggested, but not an insignificant one. She took the position at the cathedral school. She tutored reading, and it emerged within a fortnight, considerably more than reading, to a group of 12 children between the ages of 7 and 12, most of them the sons and daughters of tradespeople and minor clergy who had aspirations for their children and limited means for achieving them. She was, by every account I heard and by my own observation on the 2 mornings I passed the schoolroom window, a remarkable teacher. She expected a great deal of her pupils and gave them, in exchange, the whole of her attention and the genuine interest of a woman who found learning wonderful and could not understand why everyone else did not. The curate's wife told my mother that Miss Price had the best mind in the close. The bishop's librarian, a small, precise man named Featherstone, who was generally thought to have the highest standards of anyone in Haverton, told me personally that Miss Price had returned the botanical volume with annotations that he had found not only correct but illuminating, and that he had taken the liberty of leaving the next volume from the series on her reserved shelf. And Mrs. Alderton told anyone who would listen that the assembly had been enlivened this year by the presence of the Price girl, who was not at all what she had appeared to be, and was in fact, in Mrs. Alderton's assessment, exactly what she had appeared to be, and people simply hadn't been looking. The Duke of Streving was in Haverton for the month, staying at Haverton Park with Lord Carrington. He went about the county in the way of men of his kind, shooting, dining, attending the social events that were of sufficient consequence to merit his presence. He attended the bishop's dinner in the 2nd week of October, at which Emmy was also present, at the bishop's wife's invitation. I was there as well. I watched. She was gracious to him. Not warm, not the particular warmth she had for people she genuinely liked, but gracious. The gracious manner of a woman who has decided that the person opposite her is not worth her ill will, which is a considerably more devastating position to be placed in than open dislike. She answered when spoken to. She offered nothing further. She was more interested in her conversation with the bishop's librarian about the botanical annotations than in anything the Duke of Streving had to say, and this was apparent to everyone at the table who was paying attention. I was paying attention, and I saw, across the bishop's dinner table, the precise moment when the Duke of Streving began to pay attention too. It was when she said something to Featherstone. I caught only the end of it, something about the classification of ferns, and Featherstone laughed with the genuine delight of a man who had just been surprised by a mind he respected, and the whole table turned toward her for a moment, and she was entirely unconscious of it, still looking at Featherstone with the focused pleasure of someone in the middle of a conversation she was enjoying. The Duke was looking at her. I did not know what he was thinking. I knew what I was thinking, which was, "Too late, Your Grace, much too late." But I kept my own counsel. I was, as I have said, a schoolmaster. We keep our counsel. November came in gray and damp. The way Haverton Novembers came, the cathedral rising above the close in the mist, the elms along the north walk going bare, the lending library warm and lamplit and smelling of leather and paper, in the way that Emmy had loved since she was 12 years old. She went to the library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, after her first session at the cathedral school. I know this because I passed it on my way to the grammar school on those mornings, and I frequently found, when I passed, that there was another figure inside dark coat, a bearing I had come to recognize, who had apparently developed a strong interest in the botanical collection. I did not comment on this to Emmy. She did not comment on it to me. But one Thursday afternoon, when I came home to the rectory to find her at the parlor table with a book open, and an expression of careful neutrality on her face that I had learned to read as the active suppression of a strong feeling, I asked how the library had been. "Well stocked," she said. "Featherstone has acquired a new series on English wildflowers that I find very useful." "Anyone else there?" A pause of approximately 2 seconds. "Lord Streving was browsing the history section," she said, in the tone of a woman reporting a neutral fact. "Did you speak?" "He asked my opinion of a volume on the Peninsular War," she said. "I gave it. And he said it was a very interesting opinion." She turned a page. I thanked him and returned to the wildflowers. I looked at her. She was reading, or performing the posture of reading with the focused commitment of someone who is very much aware that their brother is looking at them. "Emmy," I said. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say something," she said. "You have a face that says you are about to say something, and I am asking you not to." I sat down. I picked up my own book. We actually read this time for the next half hour, and she was calmer when she went to help with supper, which I took as evidence that the presence of a sensible and undemanding person had been, in some small way, useful to her. I lay awake that night for some time. I was thinking about the Duke of Streving and the history section of the cathedral library, and the opinion of the Peninsular War volume that he had solicited and received, and the 3 weeks of October that had elapsed between the assembly corridor and now. I was thinking about what a man who found a woman nobody would need with a 3-week survey of the history section of a lending library if what he actually found her was nobody. I was also thinking about Emmy's face when she told me about it, and the careful neutrality that covered, I knew, something considerably less neutral. She was not indifferent to him. I had known my sister for 27 years. She was not indifferent. She was, instead, a woman who had decided, quietly, practically, without drama. That indifference was the only thing available to her, given who he was and what he had said, and she was holding to that decision with the steadiness of a person who understood that the alternative was something she could not afford. I admired her. I was also, I confess, somewhat frightened for her, because the Duke of Streving was showing every sign of being a man who was beginning to understand what he had said in the corridor, and who was not going to let that understanding rest quietly. The library encounters continued through November, twice a week, sometimes 3 times, with the increasing improbability of a man who was spending more time in the natural history section of a cathedral library than his established interests suggested, was strictly necessary. He was always correct. He never imposed. He asked her questions about the wildflower volumes. about the cataloging system that Featherstone had been discussing when he overheard it at the bishop's dinner, about a translation she had recommended to Featherstone, which Featherstone had then acquired, and which the Duke apparently read, and she answered them with the particular quality of her courtesy that was warm enough to be genuine, and closed enough to communicate, without incivility, that this was a managed distance, and she was managing it. I know the shape of these encounters in detail because Emmy told me about them, not in the way of a woman confiding a growing attachment, but in the way of a woman reporting a situation she was monitoring with professional attention and found troubling. "He was in the library again," she would say, and I would say, "Was he?" And she would give me a brief account of the exchange, and I would listen, and neither of us would say the thing we were actually thinking about. The thing we were actually thinking about, in my case at least, and I believe in hers, was this: he was not behaving like a man who had found a clergyman's daughter with no portion to be nobody. He was behaving like a man who was attempting to correct a mistake without having said out loud that he had made one, which is a particular kind of behavior I recognized from 20 years in schoolrooms. It is the behavior of a person of pride who has understood they were wrong and does not yet know how to say so. The difficulty was that understanding you were wrong is not the same as saying so. And Emmy, who had a great deal of self-possession and very little willingness to spend it on a man who had to be coaxed into the admission, was not going to help him across that distance. If he wanted to reach her, he was going to have to do it himself. He was going to have to say the thing. He did not, in November, say the thing. December arrived with the first real frost of the winter, and with it, Mr. Clement Ashby. Mr. Ashby was a solicitor of 35, recently established in Haverton, of pleasant manner and very respectable income. He had been introduced to Emmy at the bishop's dinner, and had in the week since called at the rectory twice, and attended the same church service as our family 3 Sundays running, which in Haverton's social arithmetic was equivalent to a declaration of intent. He was not brilliant. He was not interesting in the way that Emmy found things interesting. He did not read botanical volumes for pleasure or have opinions on the classification of ferns. But he was kind, genuinely kind, and he was solid, and he looked at Emmy with the uncomplicated admiration of a man who had encountered a woman he found remarkable and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. My mother thought highly of him. My father, who was beginning to feel his age and worried about Emmy's position when he was gone, thought highly of him. My younger sisters, who found him amiable and unthreatening, thought highly of him. And Emmy, who had spent 27 years being practically sensible about the realities of her situation, was considering him. I could see her considering him, with the careful, clear-eyed consideration of a woman who is deciding whether a very reasonable proposition is one she can honestly accept. I watched this and felt a heaviness I could not precisely name. It was not that Ashby was wrong. He was not wrong. He was, in all the ways that mattered to the world's accounting, entirely right. He would be good to her. He would provide for her. He would not embarrass her. He would not look at her and see nobody. What he would not do, what he could not do, and knew it no more than she did, was reach the part of Emmy that was most herself. The part that read botanical volumes and annotated them, and left Featherstone the librarian surprised and delighted. The part that said things in the middle of dances that left men of consequence looking faintly caught off guard. The part that had sat in the rectory parlor in October, holding herself very still, while she told me how she was going to arrange her life to need as little as possible. That part would not, with Ashby, be reached. It would be safe. It would be housed and fed and respected, but it would not be reached. I was thinking about this one evening in mid-December when there was a knock at the rectory door. I was nearest. I opened it. The Duke of Streving was standing on the step. He was not in his dinner clothes. He was in a plain dark coat, slightly damp at the shoulders from the December mist, and he had the air of a man who had walked some distance and thought hard while doing it. He asked if I was Mr. Price. I confirmed that I was. He asked if he might speak with me. I let him in. We sat in my study, a small room at the front of the rectory, with the lamp lit and the fire banked low, and the sound of my mother and sisters in the back of the house. He sat in the chair I offered and looked at the fire for a moment, and then said, without any particular approach, "You were in the corridor at the October assembly." "Yes," I said. "You heard what I said to Carrington?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I should like you to tell me," he said, "whether there is any ground at all or whether I have come here for no purpose." I looked at him carefully. He was not what I had expected, sitting in my study. He was less armored than the man at the assembly or the bishop's dinner. He had the aspect of a man who had made a decision that had cost him the protective distance he generally kept between himself and situations he could not manage from a comfortable remove. "Why are you asking me?" I said. "Because she will not tell me herself," he said. "Because every time I have tried to, because I have been, for 2 months, attempting to communicate something that I apparently cannot communicate directly, and I am a man who is not accustomed to being unable to communicate directly, and I find the experience clarifying if not comfortable." "Clarifying," I repeated. "I understand now what I said in October," he said. "I understand it better than I understood it when I said it, which was not at all. I said it because Carrington said she was making eyes at me and I wanted to close the conversation, and I used the words that were most available, which were the words my world gave me for women in her position, and I did not think about what they were or what they contained." He looked at the fire. "I have thought about it since, at some length." "She heard you," I said. "I know she heard me. I have known it since the bishop's dinner." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything to be said, or have I made something impossible that might otherwise have been possible?" I sat back in my chair. I thought about Emmy at the rectory table with her book and her careful neutrality. I thought about Clement Ashby at church 3 Sundays running. I thought about the part of Emmy that would not, with Ashby, be reached. "Tell me something," I said, "and answer it honestly. What do you want?" He looked at me. "I want to speak to her, honestly, without the 2 months of the library and the botanical volumes and the careful management of a distance I created. I want to say the true thing to her face and let her decide." "And if she decides against you?" "Then I will have said it," he said. "That seems better than not having said it." I thought about this. It seemed to me, on reflection, correct. "She rises at 7, I said. "She walks in the clothes before the morning school, the north walk along the cathedral." I paused. "I would not recommend approaching her in the clothes." "She is not. She will not thank you for a managed encounter in a public place." "No," he said, "I did not think the clothes." "She comes home for luncheon," I said, "alone at 12:30. He stood, he thanked me, he left. I sat in my study for a long time after the door closed. Then I went to find Emmy. I did not, when I found her, tell her that he had come. I told her only that I thought she should know, because I owed her this, and because I was her brother and she was the most important person in my life, that she should think carefully before accepting Clement Ashby's proposal, which I believed was coming before the new year. She looked at me with those clear eyes for a long time. "Tobias," she said, "is this about Streving?" "It is about you," I said, "and what you deserve." "I am 27, she said, "with no portion and no connection. What I deserve and what I am likely to receive are not always the same proposition." "I know that," I said. "I am asking you to think carefully about the difference." She was quiet. She turned back to her book, but she did not that evening say anything about Clement Ashby or his anticipated proposal. And the next morning, when I left early for the grammar school, she was in the kitchen with her coat on and her boots laced, about to go to the cathedral school, and she looked like herself. Not the careful, managed version, but the actual Emmy, clear-eyed and present, and I thought, good. Whatever happens next, that is the right starting place. The January rain came in on the 14th. It was not a dramatic rain. It was the Haverton variety, steady, quiet gray, the kind that soaks through wool coats without announcement and makes the cobbles of the close gleam like dark mirrors. Emmy had come home from the cathedral school at the usual hour. Our mother was visiting Mrs. Alderton. Our father was in his study. The younger girls were about the house somewhere. I was in my room, marking papers with the lamp pulled close, when I heard the knock at the front door. Emmy was nearest. She opened it. I heard nothing for a moment. Then I heard her say in a voice that was entirely steady, "Your Grace." And then his voice, low and without preamble, the voice of a man who had rehearsed nothing and was simply saying the thing, "Miss Price, I am sorry. I am sorry for what I said in October. I have attempted for 3 months to communicate that to you in a way that required nothing from you, and I understand now that this was a cowardice and not a courtesy, and that you deserve to hear it plainly. I said a thing that was false and careless, and I said it about a person who deserves neither falseness nor carelessness, and I am standing here in your doorway in the rain because I have run out of indirect approaches, and I would like, if there is any possibility, I would like to know you. Honestly, without the assembly rooms and the botanical volumes and the performance of a man who is attempting to manage his way back into someone's good opinion. I would like to know you plainly, if you will permit it." A pause. I had stopped marking papers. Emmy said, "You are very wet." A brief silence. Then, and I could hear in it the first honest sound I had heard from him in 3 months, something fractured and also something relieved. "Yes, I am." "Come in," she said. "I'll get the towels." I did not go downstairs immediately. I gave them 20 minutes, which seemed like the correct courtesy. When I came down, they were in the parlor, Emmy on the chair nearest the fire with the sensible expression of a woman who has offered a wet man shelter and is assessing the situation honestly, and the Duke of Streving on the settee opposite, in his damp coat, with the posture of a man who has recently said the true thing and is not yet certain whether the ground will hold under him. He stood when I came in. I waved him back to the settee. "My brother knows," Emmy said to him, in the direct way she said everything. "He knew before I did, I suspect." "He told me nothing," the Duke said, "except the time your luncheon hour was." Emmy looked at me. I looked at the ceiling with the innocent expression of a man who has simply provided information. "Tobias," she said. "He asked," I said. I answered. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she looked at the Duke of Streving, who was sitting in the parlor of the Price family rectory in his wet coat, without his rank and his consequence arranged around him like furniture, simply a man in a room, waiting. "I will not pretend," she said to him, "that it did not hurt." "I know," he said. "I do not ask you to. And I will not pretend that 3 months of the botanical volumes does not count for something," she said. "It does, though I was not always certain what it counted for." "It counted for me understanding," he said, "that I had been wrong in a way that was larger than I initially understood, and that you are—" He stopped. He tried again. "I have met a great many people in my life, Miss Price. I have not previously met a person who caused me to reconsider, at some length, a word that I had been using without examination for most of my adult life." "What word?" I asked, from the corner where I had settled with the innocent air of a man who is simply sitting in his own parlor. He looked at me. "Nobody," he said, and then to Emmy, "I used it without thinking. I have thought about it very much since." Emmy looked at him for a long moment with the clear, direct attention she gave to everything that mattered. "You may call on Thursday," she said. "In the afternoon, my father will be at home." He said Thursday. "At 3, she said, "and you should probably change your coat." He looked down at his coat. He looked back up at her. And the thing that happened in his face, not a performance, not the managed ease of a man of consequence at a social occasion, but something much simpler, was the most honest thing I had seen from him since the October corridor, and considerably more welcome. "Thursday at 3, he said. "Thank you, Miss Price." "Emmeline," she said, "or Emmy. If you are going to stand in the rain outside my father's door, you may as well use my name." He stood. He bowed in the manner of a man who is feeling the elaborate machinery of courtesy and finding it, in this particular room, slightly unnecessary. "Emmeline," he said. She walked him to the door. I heard it close. Then she came back to the parlor and sat in her chair and looked at the fire for a long moment. "Tobias," she said. "Yes." "You told him my luncheon hour?" he asked. She was quiet. "Emmy," I said. "Don't," she said, but her voice had something in it that was not the careful composure of October, something that was warmer than that and less managed and more hers. "I wasn't going to say anything," I said. "I know," she said. "You never do." We sat by the fire for a while, she and I, in the comfortable silence of two people who have been each other's company through a great deal, and have learned not to speak when speech is unnecessary. I could tell you what happened in the following months with the efficiency of a narrator who has other claims on his time. I will tell you instead with the detail it deserves, which is some. He came Thursday at 3, as directed. My father received him with the careful attention of a man who loves his daughter, and has been a clergyman long enough to know that consequence and character are not the same variable. They spoke for half an hour while Emmy was in the room, and then Emmy remained in the room while my father withdrew, which was his way of communicating without saying it, that he trusted his daughter's judgment and intended to let her exercise it. What they talked about that Thursday afternoon and in the Thursday afternoons that followed, Emmy did not report to me in detail, and I did not ask. I know the broad shape of it. They talked about books at first, because that was the vocabulary they had developed in November, and it was a good one. They talked about the cathedral school and the 12 children and the wildflower series and the correct classification of ferns. They talked gradually about less neutral things, his estate at Haverton, the tenants there, and how he managed his responsibility toward them, which Emmy engaged with the serious interest of a woman who found the practical management of human welfare genuinely important. They talked about her writing eventually, because he asked and she told him, which was the single fact I found most telling. She did not, as a rule, tell people about the writing. He asked to read some of it. She gave him 3 pages. He returned on the following Thursday and said, "I have this from Emmy," who reported it in the tone of a woman who is being careful not to read too much into a thing, that it was the most precise and alive prose he had read in several years. "Did you believe him?" I asked. She thought about it honestly, which was what she always did. "Yes," she said. "He is not a man who performs compliments." "No," I said, "he's not." She looked at me. "You like him," she said. "I think he has improved," I said, "considerably." "He has," she said, and looked out the window at the February close with an expression I recognized, the expression of a woman who has decided something and is simply living in the decision, the way she lived in everything, without ceremony and without performance, entirely present. He spoke to my father in the first week of February. My father spoke to Emmy. Emmy came to find me. "He has asked," she said. "I know," I said. "You did not tell me he had spoken to father." "He asked me not to," I said. "He wanted to tell you himself." She was quiet for a moment. "He is very concerned," she said, "about whether I am saying yes because I mean it or because it is prudent." And I told him," she said, "that I would not say yes unless I meant it, and that if I merely found it prudent I would say so plainly and let him decide what to do with that, and that I did not find it merely prudent." She looked at her hands for a moment. I told him it was the truest yes I had ever said, and the most frightening, and that I wanted him to know both of those things. "What did he say?" "He said he was glad it was frightening," she said, because it was frightening for him too, and he would rather be frightened together than certain alone. I sat with this for a moment. "Emmy," I said. "Don't," she said. But she was smiling, the real smile, not the managed one, the Emmy smile that had no performance in it whatsoever. "I was only going to say," I said, "that I think you were right about the botanical volumes." "What about them?" "They did count for something." She laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, the kind she gave only when something genuinely delighted her, and it was the finest sound I had heard in that rectory since I was a boy. They married in the cathedral in April, when the close was full of the pale green of the elm trees coming into leaf, and the stone of the cathedral walls had the warm, honey-gold look it acquired in spring light. It was not a grand wedding. Emmy had been firm on this, and the Duke of Streving had apparently concluded very early in their acquaintance that firmness on the part of Emmeline Price was a thing to be listened to rather than negotiated with. It was a cathedral wedding in the sense that the cathedral happened to be there, and to be the obvious place, not in the sense of a production arranged to impress the county. My father officiated. He was, I think, prouder that morning than I have ever seen him, not with the pride of a man who has secured an advantageous settlement for his daughter, but with the pride of a man who has watched his daughter remain entirely herself under considerable pressure, and emerge from it into something that looked like happiness. My mother wept, which was characteristic. Emmy wore ivory. She had her hair done by our younger sisters, who had argued about it for a week and produced, finally, something they all considered adequate and which Emmy considered fine, and which was, in the way of these things, simply Emmy, neat and honest and without unnecessary elaboration. He was waiting at the altar when she came down the aisle, and I was watching from the first pew, and the thing that happened in his face when he saw her, the same thing I had seen in the parlor in January, magnified and made permanent, told me everything I needed to know about the question I had been asking myself since October. She came to him with the clear, direct walk that was hers, and she looked up at him with those clear, direct eyes, and he looked at her with the look of a man who has understood, at some cost, what he is looking at and intends never to misname it again. My father said, "Who gives this woman?" I said, "Her family does." I have seen them now for 3 years, in the way you see family, the dinners and the letters and the occasional week at Haverton, where the house is considerably better run and considerably more alive than it was when it had only the Duke of Streving and his consequence to fill it. Emmy has her Tuesday mornings at the cathedral library still. Featherstone reserved the table for her, and she has occupied it with the regularity of a woman who considers her library access a non-negotiable condition of human well-being. She has her writing, which she pursues in the mornings before the household wakes, and which has, in the last 2 years, produced a volume that a London publisher received last spring with the kind of letter that makes a schoolmaster brother sit very quietly for a long time. He read the letter before she showed it to me. He had known about the book for the whole of its writing. She showed him pages. He offered observations. She told me later that his observations were, on the whole, less useful than Featherstone's but considerably more enthusiastic, and that enthusiasm had its own kind of use. When the publisher's letter came, he put it in her hands and said, "I told you," she said. "You told me nothing useful," he said. "I told you it was the most precise and alive prose I had read in several years." She said, "That is enthusiasm, not instruction." He said, "You didn't need instruction." She told me this over supper, in the same tone she used for reporting neutral facts. But I watched her face while she told me, and the thing in it, the same thing that had been in her face in the parlor in January, 3 years on and deepened, was, I am prepared to say, the finest sight I have ever seen in my life. He had called her nobody in October. By January, he was standing in the rain outside her father's door with nothing but the truth. And the truth, as it turned out, was considerable. I have been a schoolmaster for 20 years, and I have made it my business to believe that words matter, that the words you say about people, carelessly or carefully, in corridors or in public rooms, or in the simple private language of how you regard someone, are not neutral. They are the material the world is made of. Say someone is nobody, and you have made a world where that person is nobody, and you have made yourself the kind of person who makes that world. He understood this eventually. It cost him 3 months and a great deal of rain and the near loss of the most remarkable person he would ever have the occasion to know, and I count those months as, on the whole, a fair price for the understanding. He has not, in the 3 years since, used the word that way again. I am fairly certain he has not used it at all. Emmy, for her part, has not made a point of it. She is not a woman who makes points about victories. She simply continues being herself, entirely, unself-consciously, in every room she enters, and allows the rooms to make of that what they like. Most rooms these days make something useful of it. It is, I think, approximately what was always going to happen, if you waited long enough and had the patience to let a man of pride say the true thing in his own time. She was nobody. She was, in fact, everything. And he knew it in the end, knew it the way you know things that have cost you enough to stick, with the whole of himself, and without reservation, and for the rest of his life.